and welcome back to No Waffle GCSE. Today we are going to be continuing off of our GCSE Geography revision. In our last live stream, we finished off on coastal landforms and we looked at the different types of processes of erosion, deposition, and transportation. We are now going to then move on to the coastal landforms. Now, looking at this spec which you can see in front of you, we need to know about how geological structure and rock type influences coastal landforms, and then look at the erosional and depositional landforms. So let's begin by looking at the different types of rock and geological structure. So let's switch screens. Okay. So rock type and geological structure heavily influence the erosional landforms that develop on the coastline. So there are two different types of rock that you need to know of. There's hard rock, and then there's soft rock. Now, hard rock, for example, if you look at granite, hard rock takes a long time to erode. So the erosion time is very long. Whereas if we're talking about soft rock, something like clay or chalk, this is very easy to erode. And therefore, in terms of the time it takes much less time. So now knowing the different types of hard rock and soft rock, we can then see how they're two different types of coastlines. So there's two different types of coastline. The first is what we call discordant. And the second is what we call concordant. So this is all to do with the different types of rock. So imagine hard rock is blue and soft rock is red. Discordant coastlines are made of alternating bands of hard rock and then soft rock. Like this. So imagine that's the cliff face and the water. And this is where the water is. And there are alternating bands of rock, which means that the hard rock, which is represented in blue, then takes a longer time to erode than the soft rock, which is represented in red. Now, what that then means is that it's much easier to erode the soft rock than the hard rock, and therefore over time you end up with just the hard rock jutting out. But we'll explain more about that later. Now, concordant coastlines form when there's the alternating bands of hard rock and soft rock are actually parallel to the diagram. You can see that the sea is going this way and the alternating bands of rock are at 90-degree angles, so they're perpendicular. Whereas on concordant coastlines, the different alternating bands of rock are actually parallel to the direction of the sea, because the sea is going this way. Now, what we can then say is that when erosion is happening here, it will all erode at the same pace, the entire cliff face. Whereas when we're eroding in discordant coastlines, the erosion of the hard rock is going to be a lot slower than the erosion of the soft rock. So that ticks off the first point of the spec, in which you need to know how geological structure influences the coastal forms. So now we have to look at processes such as, so as headlands and bays. We need to focus in on those, and wave-cut platforms, which happen due to the alternating bands of rock. So, firstly, we have headlands and bays. Now, headlands and bays form along discordant coastlines. So we said that discordant coastlines is when alternating bands of rock are perpendicular to the sea. So what happens is the less resistant rock erodes much faster, so at a faster rate than the more resistant rock. And eventually what you get is you just get the hard rock which juts out, and the soft rock is going inwards because this has been eroded, whereas a hard rock takes longer to erode. So in this case, we call the hard rock that takes longer to erode the headlands, and the soft rock that's eroded much quicker, the bays. Now headlands are eroded further on, so headlands can be eroded as usual. All rock erodes just at different speeds. Now headlands can be eroded when we're discussing that when we're looking at the side profile of it. So imagine putting out into the sea. That's the sea. And what happens here within this diagram is that you can see eventually the headland will erode. And what happens is the water, because it's now separated, the water can now not only attack frontal way on the cliff face, but also can attack on the sides of the headland. And as they attack on the sides, this rock then has weaknesses called little cracks. Imagine these little cracks. Now what happens is within these little cracks, hydraulic power starts to happen, in which an abrasion starts to happen. So hydraulic waves smash against the cliff face, and as it smashes against the cliff face, it then widens any cracks that there might be. And there's also freeze-thaw weathering and abrasion. Then this repeated erosion eventually causes something more to form. We then see a cave forming. So we've got from a crack to a cave. Now this cave then only begins to widen and widen and widen until it continues to go throughout and deepen until the cave breaks through the headland and then forms an arch. So we have a crack, then a cave, and then an arch. Now, once we have the arch, the erosion continues and continues and continues. So it now looks like this. You can see straight through it. And then eventually, the weight over here will get too heavy, and the gravity will overcome it. So then you'll just get a stack left. And then the stack will then erode and become a stump. And then eventually the stump will just turn into nothing. So that's how you can get cave, arch, stack, and stump all from the headlands and the bays. Okay, so now we've looked at how headlands are formed. We also need to look at how waves erode cliffs. So let's look at that. Waves also erode cliffs, and waves erode cliffs to form something called wave-cut platforms. Now, wave cut platforms form when we see that, imagine this is the headland, and this is a cliff face, and then we have the water here. What we see here is that the water is going to erode the cliff face. It's inevitable. And then it then creates what we call a wave cut notch. Looks like this, like a little dig in it. So this gap here is called the wave cut notch. Now this wave cut notch can then enlarge into something more as the erosion continues, as the wave cut notch only gets bigger and bigger until this rock here then gets so heavy that the gravity actually outweighs the forces holding up. Therefore, this eventually breaks and snaps down. And then you see that it then retreats the cliff. So then you have this. And what happens is the water goes up to here, and then it creates this thing here called a wave cut platform. So waves cause most erosion at the foot of a cliff. This is called the cliff foot. Wave cut notch to form, and then eventually, as the wave cut notch widens, the gravity of the rock above it outweighs the forces holding it upwards, so then it collapses because it becomes unstable, leaving a wave cut platform. Now, ironically enough, this was the worst answered question in one of the GCSE papers when you had to describe the formation of wave cut platform, but you had to use a diagram to do so. So try and do a diagram that's much better than mine, but including these broad steps, you'll definitely get the marks. We're now going to look at how beaches are formed, which is the next part of the specification. So that's erosional landforms. Now we're going to look at depositional landforms, which we'll start off with beaches. Let me just group these together. Okay. So beaches. Now, beaches are a depositional landform. Now, we looked at how depositional means depositing. So what happens is it comes from the waves depositing sediment onto the beach. Now, a key thing that you need to know about beaches is that it's created between the high and low watermark. So what we're saying here is that the beach, the water, so we're saying that beaches are formed between the high and the low watermark. Now, you don't need to necessarily know what that means, but it's a good piece of information when describing how do beaches form and where do beaches form. Now, beaches are only formed at constructive waves. If they cannot be formed at destructive because destructive takes more sediment than it puts down. Now, constructive waves, although they're all produced from constructive waves, there's still two different. So the type of beach is a sand beach, and the second type of beach is a shingle beach. So a sandy beach comes from low energy waves, which means that the waves are flat and wide, and the sand particles are quite small. so the weak backswash can move them back down the beach, creating a long, gentle slope. So sandy beaches have a gentle slope. It's obviously full of more sand, and it's from low energy waves. So because they are that low energy, they deposit all of the sediment. Even the shingle is from high energy waves. Now, because they are high, they still have enough energy that creates the sandy beaches. However, they cannot carry the heavy rocks. So what they do is they deposit the rock on the beach, and then it creates this steep beach, and it's very uncomfortable to walk on, and tourists do not like it. And this creates a steep slope. Now, there are other depositional landforms other than just beaches that are created. So let's look at some other depositional landforms. There's things such as spits, bars, and sand dunes. Spits, bars, and sand dunes. So let's just hone in onto spits for a second now. So spits are formed when, as a result of longshore drift. So as we said, longshore drift. Oh, they're saying there's internet issues. If there are internet issues, please tell me if I'm not coming out clearly, if the voice isn't coming out clearly. But okay, spits are formed as a result of longshore drift continuing a beach beyond its coastal line. So imagine the beach looks like this, and we talked about how longshore drift then causes the waves to move in the direction of the prevailing wind, and therefore it moves along the beach like this because it comes back in a perpendicular way. So that's longshore drift. It shows how waves move sediment across the beach. But eventually it will go past and beyond the coastline, and what it does is it then starts to create this mini beach that continues. And this sort of mini beach, or the extension of the beach, is called a spit in the coastline. And longshore drift transports sand and shingle past the bend and deposits it in the sea. So, surely enough, then a sand beach will happen. Oh, just your question about what exam board. This is for AQA Geography. Okay? So, yeah, AQA Geography. So, yeah, that is how a spit forms. But just regarding the exam board, the content I'm doing now is quite universal to most exam boards. So the coastal landscapes. However, yeah, this is specifically AQA. Okay. Now, as we said, so longshore drift transports it beyond the sand and shingle, beyond the bend, and then deposits it in the sea. And then what happens is, because of strong winds, it then can create a curled end to this spit, and that's then called a recurved end. So that's just a feature of a spit. Okay. Now, another feature of a spit is the area behind. Now, because a spit is being formed, this means that this area behind is now protected from erosion. And this is then called a sheltered area. Now, this sheltered area then allows material to accumulate here because the erosion isn't affecting this part of it. So it allows material to accumulate here. Now, over time, this sheltered area behind the spit, something that we call a mud flat or a salt marsh. So, this sheltered area allows material to accumulate and can sometimes form what we call a salt marsh or a mud flat. So that's the formation of a spit. Now, a bar is practically a spit. A bar is what happens when a spit two different connects two different headlands together and creates an area behind it. So imagine we have the two headlands here. So this is a bay and this is a headland. And what happens here is the spit is formed, and eventually the spit just grows and grows and grows till it connects the bay together. And what it does is it then closes off the bay. Now, what we say is that a bar is formed. So once a spit continues and connects the two headlands together, it's then referred to as a bar. And then the bay is no longer referred to as a bay, it's then referred to as a lagoon. It's this sheltered off coastal area. Now, offshore bars can also form if the coast has a gentle slope. Now, finally, we're going to look at sand dunes and how sand dunes are formed. Okay, so sand dunes are formed when sand is deposited by longshore drift is eventually moved up. So we discussed how longshore drift happens. We have the sea, we have the beach. It moves in the direction of the prevailing wind and then returns at a 90-degree angle. So eventually, what we're saying here is that the sand is moved by the direction of the prevailing wind. But eventually, sometimes what can happen is sand dunes can form. Urban issues and challenges. Yes, I'm definitely going to move on to that, by the way. So what I'm doing is in this session, I'm going to be finishing off paper 1 and then we're going through the whole of paper 2's contents. So yeah, I will be moving on to that. I'll just mention it. So okay, I've put a little message up. I can put it at the bottom here. Okay, perfect. So yeah, how are sand dunes formed? So as the longshore drift causes the sediment to move along the beach, eventually what happens is the sand dunes are formed because after the sand is then deposited, further wind then causes the sand to move even further up the beach. We then get the wind moving up, and then we have obstacles, so things like driftwood. So imagine just a piece of wood was randomly on the beach. Then what would happen is the wind would continue to move the sand up till there, and then these obstacles would cause the wind speed to decrease in this area, so then the sand would deposit behind this driftwood, creating an embryo sand dune. which just means a small sand dune. And then what happens is, after the sand dune forms behind the driftwood, these can then be colonized by plants. And because they are colonized by plants, plants contain roots, and the roots of these plants then dig deep into the sand dune and therefore stabilize the sand dune. So it's not only just a pile of sand, it's now rooted down to the ground. And as it's rooted down to the ground, this means that as it builds up and it becomes from an embryo sand dune to a large sand dune, it then encourages more sand to accumulate there, forming foredunes and eventually mature dunes. So then what would happen after that is more sand dunes can form in front of and behind. Okay. So that is it in terms of looking back at the specification. Um, that is it for the coastals part. We do need to look at two examples, but we're going to look at that. We're going to review all of the examples and case studies. Now we're going to look at glacial landscapes in the UK. So let's show that on the specification. Yeah, glacial landscapes in the UK. Okay. So in the specification, as you can see, it says that for glacial landscapes, we need to know about the maximum extent of ice across the UK during the last ice age. So we need to know a bit of history. Let's go over a bit of history then. So, if you looked at the revision video I did, the live stream I did this morning, we looked at how the climate has always overcome change. And the current climate change is there's different periods, and we're currently in a period where we have glacial periods, and then we also have interglacial periods. So the glacial periods are the colder periods, and these tend to last 100,000 years. And then the interglacial periods are the ones in between, which are warmer and tend to last 10,000 years. Prominently, the world has had to deal with glacial periods, which then means that the majority of the time the Earth is actually very cold. Now, what this then means is that during the glacial periods, a lot of the UK itself was covered in a massive ice sheet. So the UK itself was covered in a massive ice sheet. Now, if you think 2.6 million years, because it was very much colder and not habitable by human beings. Okay, so the maximum extent of ice cover which the specification requires you to know is just telling you how much the ice covered during the last glacial period. And if you look at a map of the UK, I'll attempt to draw one here. So we've got Scotland, Wales, excuse the amazing drawing. Scotland, Wales, London, and then we've got a bit of Ireland there. So over the last 20,000 years, which is the last glacial period, the maximum extent of ice covered the whole of Scotland, the whole of Ireland, and just parts of parts of western UK. The south of England was not covered in ice as much. Just in regards to the exam board, it's AQA, by the way. Okay, so yeah, the UK was covered in a massive ice sheet, and this blue line shows the maximum extent to which ice covered the UK. So it did not cover the southern parts of England, so it stopped at roughly Leeds, and London is about here. So from London to Leeds, there was no ice. Now, it came as far as the Bristol Channel, but it did not go further than that. So this means that the erosion, the transport, and the deposition of material by ice has been really important in shaping the landscape of the UK. The reason why the spec wants the last glacial period and how it's affected the UK 20,000 years ago is because this shaped the relief of the UK now. It is caused many of the reasons why there's mountainous areas and things like that. Okay, just going back to the specification, the next thing you need to know about glacial periods is the glacial processes. So we've got freeze-thaw weathering, erosion, movement and transportation, deposition, and things like that. So let's now move on to glacial processes. But first of all, what is a glacier? It's important that you can be hugely confusing. So a glacier is just a massive block of ice. Just imagine masses of ice, and what it does is it just fills valleys and it fills hollows, and as they slowly make their way downhill, because they're very slippery, they will erode the landscape and drop all sorts of sediment behind them. Now, glaciers erode the landscape as they move. That's a key point you need to know. So as glaciers move, they erode the landscape. Now we're going to look at what are the ways in which the glaciers erode the landscape. So, firstly, let's look a bit about glaciers. So, because of the weight of the ice in the glaciers, that is a reason why glaciers move, because of the weight. Now, some glaciers have a thin layer of meltwater, and this meltwater is just parts of the glacier that melted. And this accumulates beneath the ice, and what it does is it acts as a lubricant, helping the glacier move by a process called basal sliding. So imagine we had this big block of ice. Now, obviously, ice just can't start moving on its own. It needs something to cause it to move. In order for something to move, it has a slippery surface. This slippery surface comes from the meltwater. So imagine this blue here is the meltwater. The meltwater then acts as what we call a lubricant to allow it to move down. And this is called basal sliding. Because guess what? The meltwater is on the base. Now, as they advance, glaciers then erode the landscapes in two ways. So there's two ways in which glaciers erode the landscape. The first way being abrasion. Now, this is the same as coastal abrasion, which we looked at, which is when the rocks stuck on the ice grind against the rocks below the glacier, wearing it away. Because you can't imagine the glacier to just be ice, there's also a lot of rock within the glacier. So imagine the rocks within the glacier, and then there's also rocks on the cliff face. So what it's doing here, as the rocks are grinding past each other, they're wearing each other away. So that's how glaciers erode the landscape. And the second way is through a method called plucking. So what happens is the meltwater at the base, at the back, and at the sides of the rock then freeze onto the rock, and as the glacier then moves forward, it then plucks it away. So you can imagine the meltwater is on the side, and what it does is it then attaches itself to the rocks on the cliff face and on the cliff base, and then as it moves forward, it then plucks these rocks from the cliff face as it moves. I hope this makes sense. Now, they're the two erosional methods. Luckily, there's only two, as in contrast to coastal erosion having four. But there's also some other things you need to know. So, at the top end of the glacier, the ice does not move in a straight line, circular motion. Now, when a glacier moves in a circular motion, it's called rotational slip. So, when we're talking about glacier movements, one way in which glaciers move is through circular motions, which we refer to as rotational slip. Now, what this does is this can create something called hollows and then deepen the hollows into bowl shapes into the atmosphere. Now, we'll talk about this further more. And also, there's another type of weathering that occurs, which is called freeze-thaw weathering. We looked at this when we looked at coasts, but it's also pretty much relevant here. So, freeze-thaw weathering, remember, is what happens is, first of all, the temperature goes below 0 degrees and fluctuates. So the temperature fluctuates both above and below 0 degrees. The reason why it's 0 is because that's the freezing point for the water. And then what happens is the meltwater then gets into the cracks of the cliffs as water, and then because of the temperature of the glacier, it then freezes, and we know that as water freezes, it expands, so then it puts pressure on the rock, and then when it thaws, it contracts, releasing this pressure, and this continued cycle eventually erodes away the cliff face. Now, this is all about glacial erosion, but now let's move on to glacial transportation. So, glaciers can also move material just like waves can move material. Things like sand, clay, and rocks. And they can move these very, very large distances. This is called transportation. Now, the unsorted mix of sand, clay, and rocks, so everything that a glacier holds and moves around, this is what is called the till. So we say glacial till is the way around. Now, transported material is frozen within the glacier. It's carried in its surface or it's pushed in front of it. So there's three main ways glaciers can transport material. So we've got the glacier here. It can be frozen inside of the glacier. It can be carried on top of the glacier, or it can be pushed in front of the glacier. So they're the three ways it can transport things. However, what we say is when a glacier pushes loose material ahead of them, this is called bulldozing. When it pushes it ahead. Now, if a glacier is overloaded with material, or when the ice begins to melt, the material is eventually deposited on the valley floor, forming landforms such as moraines and drumlins. Now, we're going to look at them in a second, so don't worry if they don't sound familiar to you. Now, fine material, however, most of the glacial deposits, so most of the till, is actually not sorted by size and weight because rocks of all shapes and sizes are actually mixed up together. So just like in the coast where different sizes of rocks are transported in different ways, um, in glacial processes they are all deposited the same way. However, for fine materials such as sand and gravel, these can actually end up getting washed away from the front of the glacier by small meltwater streams. So, what can happen is the front of the glacier can start melting, and this can then end up depositing the sand. Okay, so let's just return back to the specification for a moment. Now, we've discussed the deposition, movement, transportation, erosion, and freeze-thaw weathering. We now need to look at the different glacial landforms and how they result from different physical processes. So we need to look at the characteristics, the formations of landforms from erosion, and the characteristics and formations from deposition. And then there's the example, which we will look at the end of today's session. So let me get a diagram up because that will probably be the best way to demonstrate the types of glacial landforms. So bear with me for 1 minute. One diagram, so it should be very helpful. I found it on a website called savemyexams.com, so I definitely recommend you check that one out. So here it is. You can see a diagram and don't get overwhelmed at it at first. So we're going to talk through each of the various parts of these landforms. Okay. So first of all, you could see that we have within them, let's start from the beginning. So we have a pyramidal peak here. Now, a pyramidal peak happens when it's a pointed mountain peak, and what happens is it has at least 3 sides. So what happens is this is when 3 or more back-to-back glaciers erode a mountain. Okay, let me try and give you a whiteboard demonstration of it. That might be better for you in terms of understanding. Sorry, There's a bit of issue going on with this internet. So, in terms of a pyramidal peak forms when there are 3 glaciers. So imagine, or at least 3 glaciers, sometimes there's 4 glaciers. So imagine Glacier 1, Glacier 2, and Glacier 3. And imagine this one is eroding that way, this one is eroding towards us, and that one is eroding that way. This then forms a pyramidal peak because it has 3 separate sides. So that is what we mean when talking about pyramidal peaks, such as the one in the diagram shown. Now you can see that as well as pyramidal peak, we then have an arête. Now an arête is very, very similar to a pyramidal peak. How we said that a pyramidal peak comes from 3 sides of glaciers, back-to-back glaciers eroding a mountain. Here, an arête forms when 2 glaciers flow in parallel valleys. So what happens is both glaciers erode the sides of the valley, then sharpening the ridge between them. So again, let's look at the whiteboard and I can demonstrate this for you. One and your glacier 2, and they both move in the opposite directions but with the same force, and then it creates what once would be a cliff face. It then eventually makes it thinner and thinner and thinner until you get a pyramidal peak where it's just pointy at the top and forms a ridge like this. So imagine this is what you call a ridge. So that is the pyramidal peak and the arête. Now we have something called a corrie. A corrie is also called a cirque, or the other thing in the middle that the Welsh pronounce that I cannot say. Now what happens is they initially begin as hollows, so they contain a very small glacier. Now as rotational slip takes place, the hollow is eroded into a steep-sided armchair shape. So hopefully you can see the armchair shape here, because it looks like an armchair shape, and understand what that means. And that's a corrie. So it's when there's a small glacier that, because of rotational slip, instead of eroding straight downwards or diagonally, it erodes in a circular motion and almost carves into it. Now, when this ice then melts, it leaves a circular lake. Now, this lake, I hope you can see it in the middle here, is called a tarn. So tarns are small lakes left by the meltwater within a corrie. So we've talked about pyramidal peaks, arêtes, and corries and tarns. Let's talk about a truncated spur. So a truncated spur, as you can see, is this bit here, and it's a cliff-like edge which is found on the valley side, and it's formed when ridges of lands stick out and then are cut off as the glacier moves past it. So if you do coastal landforms, you'll be familiar with the idea that a headland is this hard rock that juts outwards. And what happens, oh yes, it is geography. Yeah, I think you realise. So what happens is a truncated spur is similar to that. So you have this bit of cliff that sticks out, and what happens is the glacier moves fast at a really fast rate and chops it off past it. It then cuts it and makes it this quite noticeable part here. So this is why it's called a truncated spur. So that's what a truncated spur is. And then with truncated spurs, we often see hanging valleys. So you can see a hanging valley in this dark bit here. A hanging valley are valleys formed by small tributary glaciers. Now, a tributary glacier is a very small glacier. And what happens is main glacier. So you can see the main glacier is this massive, has eroded this massive bit here. This is just a small glacier. So you can see the small glacier has flowed towards the giant glacier. And what happens is the glacial trough of the larger glacier is then eroded much more deeply. So when all the glaciers melt, the tributary glaciers valleys are left at a higher level. So we have the small glacier, and then because of the big glacier, it then erodes much deeper. So this then looks like it's at a much higher level. I hope you understood that, because that was a bit of a confusing explanation. We're now going to look at glacial troughs. So we just talked about a glacial trough, didn't we? So we said that a glacial trough is what is left as the glacier moves and digs into it. So it can either be a V-shaped valley, or what happens is it forms as a V-shaped valley. Now, just for a bit of extra information, a V-shaped valley originates from rivers. Rivers create V-shaped valleys. However, glaciers create U-shaped valleys because of the fact that it moves in a circular motion along the rotational slope. So that's what I mean by I'm saying that it started off as a V-shaped valley because it was a river, and then it created a U-shaped valley as the glacier erodes the sides and the floors, calling it a glacial trough. Now, the final thing that you need to know is a ribbon lake. Now, just as we saw that a tarn is a little lake left in a corrie, a similar thing applies. The ribbon lake is the long, thin lake that forms after a glacier retreats. They form in hollows where softer rock was eroded more than harder rock. Okay, those are the glacial landforms. A lot of people say they are the hardest part of GCSE Geography. So if you did understand them, then well done to you. They are the erosional landforms. Now we're going to look at the depositional landforms. So let me get a image like that up for you for the depositional landforms. Till then, I just want you to reflect on the specification and what you're asked to do next. Okay, so now we're going to look at the depositional landforms. So firstly, you need to get yourself familiar with the word moraine. What is a moraine? So moraines are landforms that are made out of the till that is deposited by a melting glacier. Now, we've already come across the term till, and we know that till means all of the material that's left. So a moraine is a landform that's made out of this till and is deposited by a glacier. Now, there are actually 4 different types of moraines, and they can be identified based on their position. So, firstly, we have the lateral moraines, which you can see here are at the edges here and here of the entire landform. So, a lateral moraine is a long mound of material deposited where the side of a glacier was. So, we can see that the side of the glaciers would have been here, and this is right on the edge of it. And what it's doing is it shows that how it's formed from the material eroded from the valley walls and carried along the surface ice at the sides of a glacier. So in terms of where this was carried, it was carried on the sides of the glacier for the lateral moraines, and then it eventually melted off and went on the sides. Then we have the medial moraine. Now, the medial moraine is in the middle. This is a long ridge of material deposited along the center of valley floor. Now, this actually formed when two glaciers met. The lateral moraines of the two colliding glaciers then join together to create a medial moraine. Do tell me any questions if you um, are a bit stuck, because this is a bit confusing. But so we know the lateral moraines are formed from the side of the glacial materials, and then the medial forms when there are two different glaciers and their lateral moraines then join to form one long ridge of material. Now we also have a terminal moraine, which you can see towards the end. Now, as it suggests by its name, it's built up at the snout of a glacier. In other words, at the end of a glacier, and it marks the furthest point reached by the ice. So, material that's abraded, remember, which is the rocks of the glacier eroding the rocks of the cliff, and material that's plucked from the valley is then transported at the front of glaciers. It's then deposited as semicircular mounds where the ice retreats, which you can see here. And the final one is actually a ground moraine. Now, this isn't shown in this image here. Let me check if there's... Okay, it's not represented here, but the ground moraine would actually be a moraine that you can see by these white spaces here. Now, it would just be material that was dragged along the bottom of the glacier and the base of the glacier, and then just deposited and spread out over a wide area as the glacier began to run out of energy. Now, moraines aren't the only depositional landform created by glaciers. There are two more, which we call drumlins and erratics. So you can see a drumlin here, and you can see the side view of a drumlin and the top view, the aerial view of it. So a drumlin is basically an elongated hill, and it's thought to be formed when overloaded or melting glaciers then deposit material. So this material then builds up over time, forming hills. So all you need to know about drumlins is they are elongated hills formed when overloaded material glaciers then builds up this material. And what happens is continued ice flow over these hills then shapes them. So they become round, blunt, and steep at the upstream end, and then tapered, pointed, and gently sloped. Now, the reason why is because initially, in the direction of the ice flow, it has a lot of energy and therefore it's able to move up. But then as it continues, it loses its energy and then deposits more material. Okay, now the next landform is erratics. So erratics can just be explained by this image. They're practically just rocks that have been picked up by a glacier, carried along, and then dropped in an area that has a completely different rock type. And erratics often look out of place. For example, a large boulder on its own in the middle of nowhere. It sticks out, hence the name erratics. Now, you're going to have to be able to identify erosional glacial landforms on a map, and a lot of the time you will be asked this in an exam. So I'm going to show you some images of maps and what it will look like and how to spot the different landforms before we move on to the next topic. Okay. So hopefully you can see this PDF here. So we begin with lakes, or cirques, which are often called corries. So corries are represented like this. So this thing here called glacis, that's an example of a corrie. It has a tightly packed contour in a U shape around them. So contour are the lines around them, and you can see that here the corries of the lines are very tightly packed around it, so we can tell that this is a corrie, or a cirque, or a CWM, whatever it's called in the exam. Now, that's what a corrie would look like. You will also need to look at what a tarn is. Now, this lake itself is the tarn. So remember, the tarn is the lake formed by the excess meltwater. So the corrie is this armchair shape around this tarn, and the tarn itself is this lake. Now we can also see here, we have this little pink point here. Now we see through these contour lines that we have lines going this way, lines going this way, and lines going this way. Now remember, we said that as glaciers form when there are lines going, when the glaciers are moving back onto 3 different points. So this is a pyramidal peak. This is what we call a pyramidal peak. I'll just call it PP. Pyramidal peak. So 3 glaciers are backing onto each other. Now, a lot of the time people tend to mistake this as an arête, but remember, an arête would look like this. So here, this is an example of an arête, because you can see the contour lines are going this way, and then they're going this way, and then remember, an arête only has 2 corries backing onto them, whereas a pyramidal peak has 3 corries backing into it. 3 glaciers, sorry. Now, it's also important to spot things like glacial troughs, but here's a hanging valley as well. So I don't know where the diagram of the hanging valley is. Oh, I think it's here. So a hanging valley would look like this. It would probably be a certain part of this valley. It's a bit difficult to say with this one because it's not as obvious, but you don't tend to be asked about hanging valleys because it's not something you would be able to see from an aerial view. But something you would be able to see from an aerial view are things like glacial troughs, which is basically the remains of what is left. The remains of what is left as a glacier moves through an area. So an example of a glacial trough, let me find one. I think this map had one. Well, these maps don't tend to have any. Oh, here. So a glacial trough can be represented, if you can see this pink line here. So it will be by this glacial trough. So normally there would be a lake or something here by this pink line. And then that would be representative of the valleys that are left in the glacial troughs. There's also ribbon lakes. So this here is a ribbon lake. Remember, we said that a ribbon lake is what is left in a glacial trough from the excess water. Okay. So that's a bit of geography skills. Now the next thing, as shown by the specification, is actually an example of a glacial landscape and talking about some tourism. So there's actually 2 examples in this one. However, we will go over that at the end of the session. So all examples and case studies will be at the end. So that means we're now on to paper 2, which is urban issues and challenges in a human environment. So you can see the first topic of urbanization is urban issues and challenges. So firstly, we need to talk about the global pattern of urban change, urban trends in difficult parts of the world, and factors affecting the rates of urbanization, as well as a bit about megacities. So let's share the whiteboard now. So first, let's focus on the global pattern of urban change and what urbanization actually means as well. So, urbanization, in its definition, is the growth in the proportion of people living in urban areas. Is just the growth of people living in urban areas. Now, the rates of urbanization are very different amongst different economic backgrounds. So, if you have high income countries, low income countries, and newly emerging economies, they all have differing rates of urbanization. Now, high income countries actually have a very low rate of urbanization. And the reason is because most people have already experienced urbanization. Around 80% of people who live in HICs already live in urban areas. Therefore, the rates of urbanization would obviously be low. And that is why it's actually under 1%. Now, in terms of lower income countries, they're less 30% of the population live in urban areas. This then means that they have high rates of urbanization because more people actually don't live in urban areas and therefore they have a rate of 6%. Now, newly emerging economies, you would expect to have a rate similar to low income countries, but actually they have rates similar to high income countries because, like high income countries, a lot of the people already have moved and migrated to those towns and cities because of the rapid urban development. So, the urban population is roughly 50%, and the rate of urbanization is around 2%. Now, we need to look at what causes urbanization. So, causes of urbanization. Now, firstly, there's rural to urban migration. That's the main reason for urbanization. Now, this means that people are moving from rural areas to urban areas because of push factors and pull factors. So, push factors push people out from living in urban areas, and pull factors pull people towards urban areas. Now, they tend to be opposites. So, push factors are things like lack of healthcare, lack of facilities, lack of education resources, lack of transport facilities, lack of job opportunities, things like that. And then pull factors would be the opposite of push factors. So cities have higher healthcare, better education, better transport, better facilities, and better job opportunities. And that's what causes people to migrate from rural to urban areas. Now, another reason that causes urbanization is natural increase. Now, what do we mean exactly by natural increase? So, natural increase is just when the population's birth rate. So, birth rate is how many people are born per thousand people, and then death rate is how many people die per thousand people. So, when the birth rate exceeds the death rate, this then means that the population is increasing, and therefore that is why it's called natural increase. Now, another thing is the fact that within rural to urban migration, we tend to see that people who move to these urban areas are quite young. You don't see old people moving to urban areas for in search of better life and work. And because they're young, that then means that they're more likely to children, and therefore the urban population increases, leaving all the old people in the rural areas by themselves and having less kids. Now, megacities are cities with more than 10 million, a population of greater than 10 million. Now, the amount of population, the amount of megacities is increasing by the minute. High rates of urbanization then lead to high rates of megacities. And this then means that as of 2018, there are 33 megacities. So 33 cities with more than 10 million people living in them. And furthermore, 27 out of these 33 megacities are actually found in low-income countries or newly emerging economies, which just tells you the amount of rural to urban migration. Okay, so we've now ticked off all of the spec points in terms of the ones before the case study, because then we have a giant case study of a major city in a low-income country or newly emerging economy. And in this case, we would do Lagos. So after I have gone through the content, and then I'll do a quick overview of the case studies and examples, we'll be looking at Lagos. But moving on to the next page, then we have a case study of a major city in the UK to illustrate the urbanization. So again, that would be another case study that I'll be looking at, and I will be looking at Liverpool. So if you do Liverpool, that might be helpful. And then you can see at the bottom of the spec page there, we need to do features of sustainable urban living. So how can you create sustainable urban living? So let's look at some points about that now. Okay. How can areas become much more sustainable? So, urban areas, first of all, need to become more sustainable because of the fact that urban areas have such a massive population. Therefore, most of the effects towards contributing to climate change comes from people in urban areas. That's why it's so vital for them to have sustainable lives. Now, what does sustainable living mean? Sustainable living just means living in a way that lets people meet their needs now without compromising the needs and reducing the ability for people to meet their needs in the future. So, not using too much of the fossil fuels and then leaving the people in the future to have to deal with that and things like that. So, living in a way that doesn't irreversibly damage our planet. Now, cities actually can conserve water and can conserve energy. So, water and energy are vital resources in cities. However, they're not really managed sustainably. So, we're going to look at some methods in which we can increase the sustainable living for water conservation and energy conservation. So, let's start with water conservation. So, firstly, only as much water should be taken waste. So within a water conservation scheme, they would ensure that enough water was taken to meet the needs of people, but only enough was taken that can be naturally replaced by things such as rainfall and precipitation. Now, water conservation schemes include other things, such as collecting rainwater. So, collecting rainwater and then using these in gardens and flushing toilets. things such as installing toilets that flush less water, because toilets use an inextricable amount of water that's nice and clean, as well as energy. And also installing water meters. We looked at how water meters make people conscious of how much water they're using, and therefore make people discourage people against using more and more water, and also encouraging people to use less water by turning off tap schemes and things like that. Now, an example of a water conservation scheme happened in Curitiba in Brazil. So, the government introduced policies to promote sustainable water use, including the installation of water meters in homes, hose pipe bans, and the city also used separate systems for non drinking water. Now, we're going to look at energy conservation schemes. So, energy conservation schemes will be things burning such as stopping the burning of fossil fuels to generate power, because we realize that it's not sustainable as they will one day run out. So, things such as promoting renewable energy, things such as encouraging people to make energy efficient decisions, such as using renewable resources such as solar power, encouraging solar power and people to use that in their homes, making sure that all new homes meet minimum energy efficiency requirements, encouraging people to use public transport, encouraging outdoor activity that takes you away from the electricity and electricity wastage unit usage within the indoors. Now, creating green spaces also helps a city become sustainable. So let's look at green spaces. Cities can be noisy, busy, and hot. Okay. Relax, because sometimes cities can be unsustainable because people find them unpleasant and stressful. So, creating green spaces such as parks ensures that urban areas that there remain places that people want to live and work in. So, when you provide naturally cooler areas where people can relax in very hot weather, it encourages more people to go there. They encourage people to exercise more, use alternative transport such as bikes, makes people feel happier. So, overall, green spaces have environmental benefits such as reducing air pollution, reducing the risk of areas, then water can be um, absorbed and intercepted rather than flooding, especially in areas close by the Thames. So, green spaces are very good. Another thing to do with sustainable urban living is waste. Cities produce a lot of waste, and in fact, most of the waste produced by a country is actually to do with one city. And in the UK, it is London. Now, more recycling then means that fewer resources are used. So, the more we recycle, the less resources have to be extracted, and less waste is produced, which then reduces the amount of waste going to landfill. Now, landfill is unsustainable. It wastes resources that could be recycled, and eventually there'll be nowhere left to bury this waste. So, decomposing a landfill also creates greenhouse gases, and we need to ensure that this does not exist. So, what schemes could we do to reduce the wasting and encourage recycling? Well, firstly, there is the curbside collections. Now, curbside collections are when you, instead of wasting materials that are precious, for example, if your bike has been broken, then you then put it on the curb outside your house, and then it can be picked up easily, and the resources can be then used and recycled into something else instead of going to landfill and being wasted there. Now, another way to of waste recycling schemes are really good websites. Now, they're websites that include FreeCycle and Freegal. And both of these websites offer for free loads of different things that others are throwing away. So instead of throwing it away, they're giving it to people for free. So they're really good. You can even check them out now. And I checked them out. Both of these still exist. So it's just people in your local area giving away free things. Now, the final part of this topic is traffic management. Because in urban areas, especially if any of you guys have live in urban areas, which apparently 80% of us do in the UK, there is a lot of traffic, and most of the areas, things like cars, lorries, these can cause issues in urban areas. First of all, the issues of traffic include environmental problems. Lots of traffic increases air pollution, and the release of greenhouse gases then contributes to climate change. And we know where it goes from there. Traffic congestion, however, can also create economic problems. Economic problems such as the fact that congestion can make people late for work. This can then delay things like deliveries, causing companies to lose out on money. And finally, the last issue that it creates is social issues. So, because of the more congestion, there is unfortunately a higher chance of things like car accidents, and then also the fact that congestion can cause frustration and therefore impact the health of drivers. So, how can we reduce the issues created by traffic congestion in urban areas? Well, number one, and it's probably the first thing that came up in your mind, public transport. Public transport allows a group of people to use the same method of transport, therefore reducing the carbon footprint of so many individuals to merely one, as well as the fact that it then reduces the congestion for other vehicles on the roads. So, as you said, using public transport reduces congestion. Now, London has capitalized on the market of public transport. It's famous for things like its rail network and its bus network. It's literally well known around the world for the red bus. So, the DR, which stands for the Docklands Light Railway, is an automatic train system that connects East London to the city centre. It connects East London to the city centre. And by connecting East London to the city centre, it then means that a lot of people who had to rely on cars to get there now could just use this train system. Now, it operates mostly on tracks above the street level, although lots of parts are underground, and it's used by a whopping 120 million people per year. So imagine Just one train service that's operating saves 120 million people in, say, around 60 million different cars, and its carbon footprint. So it actually does do a lot of work. Now, on top of the DLR, we have other train systems such as the London Underground. And the London Underground takes 3 million people off of the roads each year. Let me write that down. Takes 3 million people off the roads each year. And then we also have things like self-service bikes. These are available to hire. They're the most cheapest form of public transport. And in London, they have constructed so many bike lanes and specialist bike signals at junctions. So they've made it more opening and welcoming to people who use bikes. Now, another method for um, for these transport issues is how we can manage traffic flow. So ways to manage the traffic flow. Now, I don't know if you have been aware, depending on where you live, but you may be aware of congestion zones and the London. So congestion zones are basically what happens when areas of high traffic, and what the government do is the government then monetize you going into this congestion zone within a car. So say the congestion zone around London spans the M25, for example. So the M25 is this ring of roads all around London. And within zone, this then means that if you were in a car and you wanted to get into central London, what you would have to do is you would then have to pay a fee to get in and out of London because of the fact that you're using a car and not using things like public transport. Now, this congestion zone is, I think it's approximately £15 every time you go. But this really does add up. And the government then uses all this money that it gets from people paying congestion charge and then uses it to ramp up the public transport facilities, making them more appealing. We also have things such as bus priority lanes. Bus priority lanes means that it only allows buses to get through and it stops buses being held in traffic, so it makes people want to take buses as opposed to taking individual cars. And that marks the end of the first topic of paper 1. Give yourself a pat on the back. You made it through this far, well done. So the next topic is the changing economic world. It begins by talking about the global variations in economic development of life. So we will look at different ways of classifying parts of the world. So how do we measure development, basically? The limitations of different types of measures, and the DTM, the demographic transition model. So there's a bit more content in this topic. So let me get this ready for you. Just give me a thumbs up in the chat if you're finding this helpful. If you want me to go through any particular topics, also tell me. And also, is my voice clear? Because I know that sometimes it gets a bit, the voice stops working because of internet issues, and I can't even tell sometimes. So you can have a little break. Okay. So let's then move on to the second topic of paper 2. So after this second topic, then we have one more topic, and then we would have gone through all of GCSE Geography, paper 1 and paper 2. So we're almost there. Let me now share the screen. So the first thing on the spec, as we saw, was measuring development. So development itself is the progress in the economic growth, the use of technology, and improving the welfare that a country has made. So, economic growth, use of technology, and improving the welfare. So, when a country develops, it basically gets better for the people living there. So, development, in its shortest definition, increases the quality of life for people living there. Now, there are actually loads and loads of measures of development, and although it's actually quite hard to measure development because it includes so many things. But you can compare the development of different countries using some measures of development. So let's look at them now. So, firstly, we have GNI. GNI stands for Gross National Income. This is the total value of goods and services produced by a country, within 1 year. So GNI is the value of goods produced by a country. By within 1 year. So if you had a GNI of 12 billion, this meant that the country created 12 billion worth of goods and services. Now we also have this thing called GNI per head, which just means the total value of goods and services divided by the population. It's not a really good measure because obviously some people earn a lot more than others and vice versa. Okay, we then have death rate and infant mortality rate. Now, we actually discussed birth rate and death rate, didn't we? So we said these were the population of people per thousand people who were being born or who were dying um, per year. So it's an average. Actually, it's an average metric, and the infant mortality rate is the number of babies who die before they are 1 years of age. So the number of babies who die before they are 1 years of age, and this is per annum as well. Now, birth rate, death rate, and infant mortality rate, there are some issues with these three metrics because of the fact that many countries mask a lot of their information and data, especially for birth rate and death rate, because of like tensions and um, a lot of corruption in the death rate, for example. So they are lowered, but in more high income countries and newly emerging economies, these numbers tend to be more valid. Now we have just a few more metrics such as literacy rate, which is the percentage of adults who can read and write, the access to safe water, the percentage of people who can get clean water, and the life expectancy, which is the average age a person can expect to live to. Now, as I said, some of these measures have limitations. We talked about the birth rate, death rate, infant mortality rate. Another issue with these rates is because they're a social rate, they can often be misleading. Because as a country develops, some aspects develop before others. Because obviously, not everything develops at the same exact time. Now, GNI can actually be misleading as well. So the the amount of goods and products, because when you're doing the GNI per head, it's an average and variations don't show up in averages, which is another issue. Now, as we've constantly been discussing throughout this video or this live stream, countries can be classified by how wealthy they are. So we've talked about high income countries, we've talked about low income countries, and we've talked about newly emerging economies. So if we're talking about it specifically, we need to know what exactly high income countries, low income countries counter, and what exactly newly emerging economies are discussing. So high income countries are the wealthiest countries per head. So the GNI in these countries are super high. The wealthiest countries. The low income countries, therefore, are the poorest countries, the countries with the lowest GNI. And finally, the newly emerging economies. These are the countries that wealth does not stay the same. So what happens is they're rapidly getting richer as the economy progresses from the primary industries to the secondary industries. So primary industries include agriculture, secondary industries include manufacturing. Now, the ultimate measure of development is called the HDI. HDI stands for Human Development Index. Now, this combines different measures, loads of different measures, which gives you a value between 0 and 1, a country value. Now, the closer the country is to the number 1, that means the more developed they are. And the closer they are to the number 0, the less developed they are. Now, HDI is calculated using one GNI, so it uses the following ones. It uses GNI, it uses the life expectancy, and the education level. So all of these three factors, GNI, life expectancy, and education level, to provide you a value. Now, it's supposed to tell you that if it's closer to 1, it's not only more developed, but the quality of life for the people living there is much better than those with a lower quality of life. Now, overall, you can definitely search up a map which has color coded the HDIs of different countries, with larger, the ones closer to 1s being colored in certain colors, and the ones close to 0s being colored in certain colors, to notice patterns in which of the countries are poorer and which of the countries are richer. Now we're going to talk about the demographic transition model. So, the demographic transition model shows how birth rates and death rates affect the population. So, when the birth rate is higher than the death rate, the population grows, and this is called natural increase, which we looked at. Now, it's called natural decrease when the done is with the DTM. People saw that there is a correlation, which means there is a relationship with the fact that your country's development increases if there's a certain pattern to your population. So they're trying to make a link between the population and the development of a country. Now let's prove this, shall we? So stage one of a country. This is what we call a population pyramid, and you have a line here and a line here. Now the line in the middle separates the male and the female. And what you have is you have bars going horizontally, and they just depict the different ages. So as you go up the line, the age increases, and it shows how many people live at each age. So this is stage 1. This tends to be most populations, which just shows how it's high and fluctuating. There is a natural population increase. Now stage 2 shows a more, so stage 1 is the least developed. So this is least developed countries show this one here. There's a high birth rate, there's a high birth rate and a high death rate. The fact that the birth rate is high is because of the lack of contraception, and people also have lots of children have because of the fact people also have lots of children because of the fact that the infant mortality rate is high. The death rate is also high due to poor healthcare or famine. Now stage 2 shows another one. Stage 2 looks like this. So we've got the male and female line, and it's more stable. So it's more gradual. So I think, well, actually, I'm going to make it easier and draw it just as a line. So stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, stage 4, and stage 5. Stage 1 looks like this. It's very like that. Stage 2 looks more regular. Stage 3 begins to get a bit like that, wider at that edge. Stage 4 begins to look like this. And stage 5 looks like this. Almost like a rectangle down. So this is saying that as you go forward, the development increases. So we said stage 1, as you saw, there's a high birth rate because of the fact that loads of people have kids, for famine. There's a high death rate also because of poor healthcare. Now stage 2 is also not very developed. The birth rate is high because of the economy is based on agriculture, so people have more kids so that they can have more workers, and also better healthcare increases the life expectancy in comparison to number 1. Then stage 3 tends to be the ones at the newly emerging economies, and they are the newly emerging economies. So here the birth rate is falling rapidly because of the access and usage of contraception. More women work instead of having kids as well. The economy begins to change from from farming to manufacturing. So fewer children are needed to work on farms, and there's improved healthcare, and there's more spending. Now, number 4 is for stages 4 and 5 are for high income countries. So here we have low birth rates, high standard of living, which is why people tend to live for longer, and they have elderly relatives as well. There's less money available for having children because of the fact that there's loads of elderly relatives. The healthcare is quite good, and therefore the death rate is low, and there's a high life expectancy. Okay. Now we're going to look at uneven development, reasons for uneven development in terms of physical and economic, historical, and the consequences of it. Okay. So in terms of the specification, where we are at, we have looked at We've looked at the way of sort of classifying the world, the economic and social measures, and we've looked at the DTM. We're now going to look at causes of uneven development as well as consequences of uneven development. Okay, so let's begin by looking at causes, then, shall we? Issue. Okay, perfect. So hopefully you can hear me. Now just going back to uneven development. So physical factors can affect how developed a country is. Now there are 4 physical factors that affect the development of a country. A poor climate, poor farming land, few raw materials, and lots of natural disasters. So climate, let's talk about climate. So when there's a poor climate, countries have a really hot or cold or a really dry climate. Now, all of these mean that not much will grow because plants need a balance in order to grow. This means that not much food can be produced, which can lead to something called malnutrition. Now, let's talk about poor farming land. So, if the land in a country is too steep or if it has poor soil, then it would be difficult to grow crops or to graze animals to produce food. Therefore, it will have the same effects. People will have fewer crops to sell, less money to spend on goods and services. As less is sold and less is bought, the government gets less money from taxes, and it's its whole system. Now, we've done poor farms. Fewer raw materials means countries without many raw materials like coal, oil, and metal ores then have fewer products to export. They tend to make less money, aren't able to spend the money, and some developing countries have a lot of raw materials but can't afford to develop the infrastructure needed to exploit these areas. Okay. And the final one is the amount of natural disasters. So there's definitely a correlation between the countries that experience the most natural disasters as well as the poorer countries, except the anomaly being with a ridiculous amount of money. Um, but yes, so okay, they are the physical factors. Now there's also economic factors that come into play when we're looking at what causes uneven development. Firstly, poor trade links. This means that trade is just the exchange of goods and services between countries. Now, world trade patterns who influence a country's economy. Now, if a country has poor trade links, this means that they won't get access to countries that will spend their money on them. So there's less money then spent on development. Now, the next one is lots of debt. Countries with lots of debt tend to only start borrowing more and more money to help cope with the current debts that they have. This money then has to be paid back, which means that there's less money for development. We also have an economy based on primary products. So countries that tend to export only primary products, which is just the raw materials, such as like fish, uncooked things, like uncreated things like materials, they tend to be less developed than countries that export manufactured goods, which are those countries that also turn the products from primary into manufactured goods. Now, the prices of primary products also fluctuate. Sometimes the price falls below the cost of production. For example, in 2018, the price of cocoa dropped below the cost of production in Ghana, and many farmers had to rely on subsidies from the government. And wealthy countries can also force the prices of the raw materials down as they buy them from poorer countries. So, poor trade links, lots of debt, and an economy based on primary products. Now, let's look at some historical causes of uneven development. So, one is, you could refer to them as the two C's. One is colonization and one is conflict. So, countries that were colonized by another country are often at a lower developed level when they gained independence than they would be if they hadn't been colonized in the first place. So, this then means that it almost it doesn't benefit them at all being colonized because a lot of the goods and services that they had were exploited and taken advantage of so that and left them with nothing. Now, European countries colonized many countries in Asia, Africa, Australasia, and the Americas between the 16th and the 20th centuries. So they spent 4 centuries in other countries being colonized. The colonizers then removed the raw materials and sold back benefits only went to the rather than the colonized countries, increasing the inequality. And colonization also prevented the colonized countries from developing their own industries. Conflict. So, conflict normally refers to war, especially civil war. This can slow down or reduce development, or even after the war is over. Money is spent on arms, on training soldiers instead of development. People are killed, facilities are destroyed, and overall, war is just a big black hole in the bank account. Furthermore, there's increased infant mortality rates and a decline in literacy rates. For example, in 2008 in Syria, it had a HDI value of 0.65, and then in 2016 it dropped to 0.54. This is mainly because of the literacy rates. Now, we're going to look at the consequences of uneven development. So, uneven development leads to differences, also has caused humongous flows of international migration. So, consequences: wealth. So, people in more developed countries have a higher income than those in less developed countries. For example, the GNI in UK is 40 times the GNI in Chad. So, we have inequalities in wealth. Okay. We also see that uneven development can lead to big inequalities in wealth within the countries as well. For example, in Kenya in 2017, the richest 10% on average earned 23 times the average salary of the more than the poorest 10%. So wealth can also impact people's standard of living. Now let's talk about international migration. Because of uneven development and unequal opportunity, many people from LICs and NEEs move to high income countries to escape conflict or to improve and work hard for a better quality of life. For example, over 130,000 people moved from Mexico to the USA legally each year, and thousands more enter illegally in search for better paid jobs and a higher quality of life. Migrant workers contribute to the economies of the high income countries they move to instead of the licks they leave, which further increases the development gap because we see that as the people move in to the higher income countries for job opportunities and things like that, they are neglecting their own countries and then furthermore increasing the inequality. Now, we need to know about, or you guys need to know about the strategies in which we can reduce the development gap. Now, there are 7 strategies, and you can most definitely be asked about this in the exam. However, the most I've ever seen is a 4 marker, so you shouldn't be too worried about memorizing all 7 methods, but you should definitely be at least aware of them. So, firstly, it's investment. The first one is investment. So, foreign direct investment is when people or companies in one country buy property or investment in infrastructure in another country. So, foreign direct investment then leads to better access to finance, technology, and expertise for the people living in that country, as well as improved infrastructure. So, an example of when this happened was between 1987 and 2018. Vietnam received FDI worth more than 182 billion US dollars. This then helped Vietnam develop many industries, such as the motorbike manufacturing industry and the telecommunications. So we can see how useful investment is. The next method is aid. Money or resources can be given to a country, especially when there's things such as natural disasters that happen. The money is then used for development, um, schools, building dams, wells, and providing farming knowledge to people. An example of this is between 2018 and 2019, the UK provided £180 million in aid to South Sudan, funding 17 projects that actually helped improve access to water, healthcare, and education. Now, aid can definitely help, but sometimes it is wasted by corrupt governments. So they do need to be careful in terms of corruption. But the next strategy to reduce the development gap is fair trade. Now, I'm sure you're all aware about fair trade. So, fair trade movement is about farmers in low-income countries getting the fair price for the goods that they're producing. Companies who want to sell these products labelled as fair trade then have to pay producers a fair price. However, another issue with this system is that they go all the way to the countries and the governments, but then they do not go towards the actual farmers themselves. So, again, the issue of corruption is at hand with this one. Then we look at using intermediate technology. So, intermediate technology includes tools, machinery, systems, that improve the quality of life, but are also affordable for the people to use and simple for the people to use. For example, in parts of Nepal, there were solar powered LED light bulbs used, and this allowed people and therefore improved their academic prospects and their job prospects. So, intermediate technology can be really useful for these countries. Then we have microfinance loans. So, because of the fact that um, lots of people, especially who live in slums, are not given any economic help or aid or even any worth socially, microfinance loans are when in low income countries charities who may be who will just be refused to get a loan from the bank. Oh, in terms of what topic this is topic 2 of paper 2. So this is, let me just get the exact name. This is the changing economic world. So this is the second topic of paper 2. We're just going through the content, and then after we go through this topic, we're going to go through the final topic, and then we're going to just do a quick overview of the case studies and examples, and then we would have gone through everything today. So, yeah, that's all right. Thank you, Emma, for your question. Okay. So yeah, microfinance, providing loans, small loans to people, and helping them become financially independent. Um, An example of this is people who joined a microfinance organization benefited from higher incomes and were actually able to start investment. Now, although microfinance loans works for some people, it can also cause problems by encouraging people to get into debt. So you can definitely see how there's disadvantages to each one. So perhaps in your exam, in your 2023 exam, you may be asked about what are some disadvantages of the strategies. And you can definitely tell them. Um, the next one is industrial development. Oh, I forgot to write down intermediate technology. So let me just write that there. Intermediate technology. Okay, but in terms of industrial development, this is in countries with a very low level of development, agriculture can make up a large proportion of the economy. So, industrial development is developing the industry and moving away from farming, which doesn't generate as much money, to something such as manufacturing, which not only provides people with jobs but higher skilled jobs. Now, the final solution and strategy for the global development gap is debt relief. This is larger countries who have debts, who have given debts to poorer countries to give them debt relief and cancel their debt relief on the basis that they do something in return, for example. Um, I think in 2006, Zambia had a $4 billion worth of debt, and it was all cancelled. All cancelled. The whole thing has cancelled. And what it did was it allowed Zambia to start a free healthcare scheme. Okay, so now just returning back to the specification, we've done all of the content up until that example you can see there, and that example of how the growth of tourism helps to reduce the development gap. As I said, we'll be going through that later on. Then, on the next page of the spec, it's about the economic development in a low income country or uh, a newly emerging economy, and it's a case study. And when we return back to that later on, that will be about India. And just some more information. Okay, and then the next topic, which is on the next page, which you're looking at, is the economic development in the UK and for the futures of the UK. So we need to look at the causes of economic change, deindustrialization, the decline in the traditional industry, the movement towards post-industrial industry, the social and economic changes in the rural landscape. Luckily, a lot of the content we've already covered overlaps with this topic quite a lot, so we wouldn't have to go too into depth with what we've just done. Let me just check something. Yeah. Okay, so there's not too much information on this that we need to know. Okay. Let us now go over the last just proportion of 2B, sorry, and then we're on to topic 2C, and then we'll be done with the content. How exciting. Okay. And well done for everyone watching. We're almost there, we're almost done. So great job for getting this far. You're definitely gonna do amazing in your GCSEs if you're this dedicated. Okay. So economic development in the UK. So the UK's economy has changed. It used to be based on manufacturing. Now, manufacturing is what we call the secondary industry. So the primary industry is stuff like farming, anything to do with primary products. So things like getting the raw materials, such as getting the coal, getting the oil, getting the livestock, and things like that. That's the primary industry. The secondary industry, as shown here, is manufacturing, and this is when you're converting the primary products into the final products through this method of manufacturing. And then we have tertiary. Tertiary is things like services. This can be something like teachers, retail, entertainment, things like that. And then you have your final one, your quaternary, which is information technology. And as you go up the primary, secondary, tertiary, quaternary, you'll soon realize that the further you go up, the more money you will make. Okay, so as discussed, UK's industry was mainly manufacturing. However, a change was made. A massive change began in the 60s. So what happened was the manufacturing industry, which I'll represent by the letter Hello, everyone. Are you still able to hear me? I'm so sorry about all of these issues. Um, just, I do hope you're able to hear me. If you are able to hear me, please let me know. If not, I know. Oh, okay, thank you so much. It's really taking a toll. I think the internet is being used a lot at this time of day. Sorry, back to what we were saying. So, obviously, the industry changed from the manufacturing industry to the tertiary and the quaternary sector. In 2017, 83% of the UK's workforce was just in the tertiary and quaternary sectors. Now, this is a massive, massive change from what it once was. Okay. Now, there are loads of quaternary industries, which, as I said, was things like sciences, research, and IT. And things like science parks are the new quaternary industries. And these are often, and they have good transport links. They're near universities, near transport links, and therefore sometimes you will be asked how are science parks adapted to increase the influx of people, and you could say, yep, they're near universities, they've got good transport links, and clusters of related business in one place that can all boost each other up. Now, economic change can have one of three main causes. So, economic change within the UK has one of three main causes. Firstly, deindustrialization. So, this is the decline of the industries that we talked about. So, the decline of the manufacturing industries. Now, this led to masses of job losses everywhere. And as other countries industrialized, they produced goods more cheaply than the UK, increasing the competition. So that's why the UK decided to import all of its goods from other countries because it was much cheaper labor that they could exploit poor people rather than their own. Okay. There's also the second reason is globalization. Now, globalization is the world becoming more interconnected through development, and a lot of manufacturing has moved overseas where the labor costs are lower. For example, Marks and Spencer's manufactures clothes in India and China. So a lot of manufacturing companies have moved overseas. Some TNCs, which are transnational corporations, have moved their tertiary and quaternary sections to the UK. For example, Apple employs 6,500 people in the is government policies. So government decisions on investment, on support for businesses, this can all affect the economy. So in the 1980s, several key manufacturing industries that had been owned and run by the government were actually privatized. For example, steel and shipbuilding led to major job losses, but it increased the efficiency. So, since the 1980s, the government have now decided to carry out lots of deregulation, which means removing the restrictions and removing the taxes on businesses to encourage entrepreneurs to invest and investors to move to the UK. So, the government is trying to make businesses return to the UK. Okay. Now, the industry can have negative effects on the environment, unfortunately. Factories can release pollutants, greenhouse gases, running them uses lots of energy and water as well. Therefore, lots of industries, especially the manufacturing industry, is definitely not sustainable or good for our environment. So, what does this mean? What do we have to do? Well, extracting the raw materials can also damage the environment. So, in order to better the care for the environment, we need to ensure that modern industrial developments are more environmentally sustainable. And the example that I'm just going to quickly mention is the Unicorn Group. So, in the Unicorn Group, it's just a modern manufacturing company which creates various products. And because of these various products that they create, in Northern Ireland, it means that their production is sustainable because it uses solar panels. And because of the use of solar panels, it then generates all of its energy from 100% renewable resources. It also uses biomass um, biomass boilers in its factory, and it also reduces its waste by recycling leftover steel and leftover plastic. So just to help you remember, this is called the Unicorn Group, and it's found in Northern Ireland. Now the UK has a good but also improving transport network. So we've already discussed how the transport network is important in terms of ways to reduce the congestion, which is bad for the environment. But there's also methods in which the UK is trying to expand its public transport in order for more people to use it. So the main method they're trying to do this in terms of the rail is through the cross rail venture. So this is basically a scheme that is planned for the future, and it's planning to increase central London's capacity by 10%, which is a lot because a lot of people try to get there, when it opens fully. The proposed HS2 line linking London, Birmingham, Leeds, and Manchester will also aim to reduce the north south divide. Okay, now the UK has loads of strong links to countries. The UK is connected to the wider world in many, many ways. So through trade, through culture, through transport. So in terms of trade, the UK trades globally. Its overseas exports are worth 160 billion. And in terms of culture, it has very strong creative industries. It's exported worldwide. For example, the Shaun the Sheep TV series, made in Bristol, is shown in 170 countries. Immigration has also helped shape the UK's culture, leading to more cultural diversity. Transport as well. The Channel Tunnel links the UK to France, providing a route to mainland Europe. There's also large airports like Heathrow, which act as an international hub linking UK to the rest of the world. In terms of electrical communications, there's telephones, the internet, making it easier for people to talk to people in different parts of the world. Now, in terms of economic and political links with other countries, the UK is part of the EU, which is an economic and political partnership of 27 countries. Well, actually, sorry, we're no longer part of the EU. I think this textbook is just out of date, actually. So I guess you can't really say that, but you can say we used to be part of the EU, and you can also talk about the Commonwealth, how the Commonwealth is an association of 54 states, including the UK, and its former colonies as well, which promotes cooperation between the member countries and lots of trade links. Okay, so we also need to look at the North-South divide. So we're approaching the end of this topic, and then we can quickly go over the next topic, and then we'll be done soon. So there's also something that exists called the North-South divide. I'm sure you must have heard of it before, and this just shows how the changes in the UK economy causes population growth or decline in rural areas. So in South Lakeland, Cumbria, this is an example of a rural area. So we've got South Lakeland. So in this rural area, it's found in northwest England, and it includes the Lake District National Park. And what happens is that the population between 2005 to 2015 actually decreased by 0.5%, which is a massive, massive amount. This is just an average because some places even saw a drop of 4.3%. Now, this is a rural area, and the reason why is because this area used to be heavily a manufacturing and agricultural area used for many things like that. However, because they were both in decline because of the post industrial economy, this meant that loads of people lost their jobs and were forced to move to areas such as the city, in which the new industries were being favoritized and there were better pay conditions. Population decline has loads of economic impact. For example, in this area, shops such as Game Station have closed, while others, including Marks and Spencers, are at risk of being closed. They have loads of social impact. Because the young people have left, this has then left a higher proportion of older people who are unable to work. Now, this is an area of population deficit and decline, but there's also areas of population incline. Okay. So places such as North Somerset, which is a rural area again, but it's in southwest England. So the area's population between 2005 and 2015 increased by 7.8%, sorry. Now this is a massive increase for only 10 years, and this just shows how some people are doing urban to rural migration. And such as the house prices rose because they were more in need, it had social impact, the roads were congested, services were oversubscribed, such as schools, and many people had to move to the area were elderly, which increased pressure on healthcare as well. Oh, thank you for your request. In terms of case studies, I was going to do them at the end of this video, but I think otherwise this live stream would be too long. So I was going to go through all the case studies and live streams sometime this week. Case studies and examples sometime this week, but definitely there's going to be one next weekend where I go through all of them in depth. So there will be a video coming out soon. I think it's good to get the knowledge in first and then get the case studies and examples. what you're on at the moment. So currently we are on topic 2B. So we're towards the end of topic 2B, and then we're going to go on to topic 2C, finish that off really quickly. And yeah, I did start this going through the whole of the GCSE geography in the previous live stream actually. So from this live stream we were just finishing off paper 1. So the other one was paper 1. Oh, this is AQA. Yeah, this example is AQA as well. Okay. So yeah, we were just gonna finish this topic. So yeah, evidence of the north-south divide in the UK. That's the next topic we're on. Feel free to ask any more questions, anyone who's watching. So we will be doing case studies and examples in a whole new video, don't worry. I think it's good to do the content and the case studies separately so that the knowledge sort of sinks in. But yeah, thank you for showing your interest. So in terms of the evidence for the north-south divide, the decline of heavy industry has had more of a negative impact on the north of the UK, including Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland. But the growth of the post-industrial service has benefited. So what we're saying is that the change from the manufacturing industry to the tertiary and quaternary sectors suggest that it only benefits the southern England, and actually deprives northern England of what they had done before, of what they had before. Now you can think about where you are from in England, and is the area tended to be deprived? Are you going over the basic and general knowledge? Yes. So what I'm doing is I'm going over all of the content except the examples and the case studies. So the things you need to know that are on the spec, beyond the examples and case studies. The points of expansion. Yeah, you could say that. I can show you the spec. 1 second. So here is the spec. So yeah, we were just going through the points of the spec. So every time there's a point, I just go and explain it. And then if people ask me to explain certain things, I do that as well. There'll be loads more of these up until GCSE as well. So if you missed it, don't be afraid, because there will be loads more of these live streams, because I really want to help you guys out. But yeah, we're going over them. Okay, so yeah, the manufacturing industry decline has benefited the south but has deprived the north. So what this is saying is that it tends to be a more positive effect for the south than the north, and this has created a divide called the north-south divide. Now, this means that things like the wages, the incomes, and the education is actually far better in the south in terms of results and money and statistics, as opposed to the thing. You missed half of it. Don't worry, don't be sad, don't worry, there's going to be loads more of these streams in the future. Oh yeah, as you said, you can rewatch it later as well. Yeah, because I will be posting these like as videos as well if you want, if you find it helpful. But yeah, we will be going over these multiple times before the GCSEs. So yeah. Okay, wages, income, and education tends to be better in the south. However, there are some exceptions. So wealthy areas in the north, parts of Cheshire, and places with high deprivation in the south. So there are some anomalies. Oh, history or geography. I'm teaching geography, but I also have other subjects I'm doing, such as English, maths. I'm doing all of the sciences. I'm doing French. So hopefully you find something useful in my videos for No Waffle GCSE. I also have Instagram, Notes Waffle GCSE, and I posted my GCSE notes for maths because I got grade 9s in all the subjects. So I'm trying to help you guys out by giving you my resources. So you can feel free to check those out as well. But yeah, okay. So the North-South divide. Okay, how is the government trying to resolve? Oh yeah, you can. You can message me on Instagram at note. I'll give you the thing. 1 second. Notes. Yeah, that's the Instagram, by the way. Okay. Um. So yeah, the government is trying to sort out the economic development issues and the regional differences, and the way they're doing that is there's three methods. So, firstly, the first method is called devolving more powers. Oh, sorry. So, devolving more powers means that instead of it being like the government is controlling the whole of the UK just from one country, it is the government giving powers to local councils so that they can manage um their own sort of things. Have you... Oh, don't worry, you're not distracting me. I don't mind helping you guys out, so don't worry. But yeah, you can message me on Instagram and I can continue a conversation there. Okay, so devolving powers, which means giving powers from the government to the local councils. And what this does is instead of the government creating this and making decisions which aren't exactly helpful for the overall councils, it's giving them specific it's giving them powers over their own, because the local council will know more about their situation and their economic situation and things they need to improve on and development projects, as opposed to the government trying to make decisions that will please the whole of the United Kingdom. Okay, so that's what devolving more powers does. The second point is creating... So around 50 enterprise zones have been created. So what happens is these enterprise zones basically encourages businesses to go to rural areas and things like that. In return, the government then gives them reduced taxing, simpler planning rules, financial benefits, and things like that. So they're basically bribing big companies to move to these rural areas so that more people can get jobs in these areas. An example of this was in the Sheffield City Region Enterprise Zone in 2011, but I'm not going to go over that just now. Okay, and the third method of equalizing and reducing the north-south divide is the Northern Powerhouse. House is basically a plan from the government to reduce the inequality between the north and south by attracting investment and improving transport links between the northern cities. So, what it's doing is instead of having to move to London in order to work in London, you could live in somewhere like Manchester, and by improving the transport facilities, you could keep moving in and out really quickly. And the plan is aiming to extend the coverage of superfast broadband as well and spend 70 million improving schools. However, it has been criticised as a concept rather than an actual plan, because it's not always clear where the money is going to come from, and there's been no action towards it. And we're currently in an economic crisis right now. So the people who do GCSE Geography in 10 years' time, yeah, so you can definitely tell that this Northern Powerhouse scheme is not really likely to occur. And guess what, guys? That is the end of topic 2b. So we only have 2c next, and that is a really small topic. So let me show you the spec for that one. Okay, wait. Okay, 2c, topic 2c. So Wait, let me just double check. Oh no, that's 1C, paper 1. Okay, yeah. The challenges of resource management. So first we need to talk about the significance of food, water and energy to the economy and also to our social well-being. So everyone knows that we need food, we need water, we need energy to survive. Well, we don't necessarily need energy, but we do at the same time. We do need energy. So let me share this tab. So, in regards to food, when people can't access enough safe, nutritious food, they can't eat the right balance of nutrients. So, when there's not the right balance of nutrients, this is called malnutrition. So, when people can't have access to the right amount of nutrients, we call this malnutrition. Now, malnutrition includes undernourishment, and it's when people don't get food of any kind. So, undernourishment is you don't get any food, and malnourishment is when you don't get enough food. Hi to AAA. Welcome. We're just approaching the end. We're on the final topic of geography, but feel free to skip back if you want. Okay. So, that's what malnutrition is, and that's the importance of food. The importance of water. People need clean, safe water for drinking, for cooking, for washing. Potable water is really important. Are you doing resources and management food option? Firstly, I'm just going over the global distribution, and then I'm going to go over food and then water. So, yeah. Okay. So just overall, first of all, and then we go into food. Water is needed for sanitation. Clean water is needed to reduce waterborne diseases, and water is needed to produce food, clothes, and many products as well. Now, energy. So countries need energy for industry and transport, as well as for use in homes. Electricity no worries. Electricity allows countries to develop their industry, to create jobs, to create wealth. So, electricity is a key point in allowing a country to develop in terms of economically. Now, you need to know about how the global supply and the global consumption of resources is unequal. So, supply is not equal to consumption. What this means is that the countries that are creating most of the resources are not the countries that are consuming and using all of the resources. Um, Also, how long do you think we should be revising a day to achieve a grade 9? Also, could you help on writing grade 9 markers for geography? In terms of how long I think you guys should be revising, when I did my GCSEs, I got all grade 9s. Not to flex or anything, but I didn't during the Easter. I didn't revise overly. Like I revised roughly 4 hours a day, but then on the weekends I relaxed as well. I think I did most of it um a week before my GCSEs, which sounds really bad, but I think that is what mainly triggered most of my revision. So the Easter, I did roughly 3 to 4 hours a day. Um, and in terms of the grade 9 mark questions, I will be doing live streams this week for you guys, which will be answering GCSE Geography exam questions. And as I answer them, there'll be 4 mark answers, and I'll be giving you loads of questions. So I'll be giving you all the resources I used when I did my GCSEs. So hopefully that helps you. Okay, sorry for getting off topic for everyone who wants to watch the video. So yeah, the countries that are supplying most of the products aren't always the countries that are consuming the products because the global distribution of resources is actually very uneven. Some countries don't even have energy reserves. Others have very dry climates or environment because they are landlocked, for example, so they don't have access to like water, just how unlike how Britain is an island, so we have a lot of access to water. So in terms of high income countries obviously consume a lot of resources, but in terms of supply, we don't tend to supply the primary resources of food, water, and energy, and enough to for people to survive by. In terms of newly emerging economies, In terms of newly emerging economies, the consumption is increasing rapidly, and the industry is developing really quickly as well, and the population and wealth are also increasing rapidly. So the consumption is increasing rapidly, but still, the newly emerging economies have nowhere near amount of consumption as the high-income countries do. High-income countries waste so much resources, and it's really sad to see that happen. But so the consumption of resources is increasing, and obviously in low-income countries, this is. I did do videos on the food resources and water resources, which are really helpful in terms of explaining this a bit more. But if you get the prospect, then that should be fine. So we're now going to look at food and how the different types of food are becoming more popular. Okay. So the different types of food that are in demand within the UK specifically has changed. So before the 1960s, most of the fruits and vegetables on sale were locally produced as well as seasonal. Now, what both of these mean is locally produced means that obviously it was created within the UK, it was grown in the UK. Now, seasonal is referring to the fact that it was created during that season. For example, sometimes we can get food such as pineapples during the winter in the UK and bananas during the winter in the UK. Now, obviously, that means that is not seasonal because bananas wouldn't technically grow in that time of year. So it's got chemicals and things like that. So in the 1960s, the majority of the food was very different to how we eat now. How we eat now, we tend to look at the three food groups. So we look at high value foods, things like exotic fruits, vegetables, spices, coffee, things we tend to actually take for granted. Now, as people's income is increasing, the access to these type of foods have actually increased as well and become more popular. These foods are often grown these foods are often grown in the UK, and for example, poor countries such as Ethiopia grow them. Now we also have seasonal, which we discussed as food that's only available during the month that it's grown in. Fruit and vegetables in the UK are imported to meet the demands of seasonal produce all year round. For example, strawberries from Mexico during the times of months where UK cannot grow them. And finally, organic produce. Now, organic produce refers to when people become more concerned about the environmental impact of food production and how chemicals can affect their health. So, organic food production is food production that's strictly regulated, so no artificial fertilizers are used, products is growing as people are more conscious of what we are eating. So the carbon footprint of our food is growing. So in terms of the food that we get, it not only has to be grown, it not only has to be processed, it not only has to be packaged, then sent to the supermarket, so transported, and then not only do we have to travel and get it, this all creates a massive. So the footprint of our food is only growing as more countries have formed lifestyles like the UK, for example. Um, The distance that the food is transported to the market is called food miles. And more food miles then means that more carbon dioxide is therefore produced. Now, people are becoming aware of our environmental issues caused by transporting food over long distances, which is leading people such as farmers markets, shops, and locally produced vegetables. So as the UK has as the UK has developed since the 1960s, there's been a growth in agribuses in the UK. So agribuses are large-scale industrial farming where all the processes from the production of the seeds to the fertilizing to the processing and the packaging all occurs here. Agribuses. So imagine these massive, massive farms, and they're controlled by large companies. Now, these tend to mean that a lot of the fertilizers used are often cheap but are made to appeal to the customers. So we definitely need to think a bit more about how we're choosing to eat our food. Now, in terms of managing the UK's water, the UK's water demand varies across the UK. The north and west of UK have high rainfall. These are areas of water surplus. So if you look at my video, which I did was managing the UK's water, managing the energy in the UK, you can see the graphs of how the demand for water varies across the UK. So um, I'll just give you a summary now because I'm unable to show you at this point. But the north and west of the UK have the highest rainfall. However, so these are the areas of water surplus. However, the southeast and the Midlands, so areas like London, have the highest demand. And these are areas of water deficit. Deficit means when um, there's greater demand for something than the supply. Now, the demand for water is increasing because more people are using dishwashers, more people are using appliances, washing machines, changing our lifestyles, more population is increasing. So, a lot of things cause the demand for water to increase, and the same goes with the demand for energy. Traditionally, the UK relied on fossil fuels. It relied on, in 1970, 91% of the energy came from fossil fuels. The discovery of large gas reserves under the North Sea, however, meant that 22% of the energy was then supplied by gas in 1980, and in 2014, 19% of electricity was generated by renewable resources. Renewable resources. Now, in terms of exploiting energy sources from that cause economic and environmental issues, it can both cause problems. So in terms of economically, when we extract fossil fuels, it can be expensive, and now the fossil fuels are rising because of the higher demand for it. Also, the fact that the North Sea oil is especially expensive to produce, both are really expensive. In terms of environmentally, obviously, we know the impacts of fossil fuels on the environment, the carbon dioxide, the methane, a lot of things. Okay, so in terms of the global demand for food, let me try and get the map up 1 second. So, okay, so here you can see a graph, and within this graph, you can see that there's the daily supply of calories. So here it's talking about the food supply. So which countries are supplied the most? Now you can see the densest regions, such as the USA, So higher income countries tend to eat a lot. They can also afford to import loads of a large variety of foods and have a higher income so can buy more food. Now, lower income countries such as Ethiopia and countries within Africa, they consume a lot less water, a lot less food, sorry. And this then means less is available and people can't afford as much. And then newly emerging economies, as you can see, like China, begin to consume more and more food as their wealth increases. Now, I wonder if there's a graph showing the amount of food produced between countries. Okay, no. So this graph shows the inequality. So how unequal the countries are. So there's definitely a lot of inequality within Africa, um, within some parts of Europe, but within the USA again, it remains in countries. So when we talk about food security is when people are able to eat enough nutritious foods that they can stay healthy and active. Now, food insecurity is when you can't get enough food to stay healthy and active. Now, globally, the food consumption is increasing. And it's because of two main reasons. One is rising population. The global population is increasing and expected to reach 9 billion by 2014. So we're currently at 7 billion ish. So we're going to get to 9 billion by 2014, which is very close. It's only like second reason is economic development means countries are getting wealthier. Wealthier countries have more disposable income and therefore they can afford to import food all year round so people no longer just eat what is seasonally available. And then we have industrialization of agriculture, which means some countries are able to produce more food at a lower cost. Now, food supply is affected by loads of different factors. So there's human factors, and there's physical factors. Okay, so I found this good website which shows the factors in more detail. So on this website, you can see here that the factors affecting food supply. So the first one is climate. Now, climate shows how countries with climates that are unsuitable for farming, such as, for example, they're too cold, can't really grow much food. So it affects the productivity and also the fact that if you're a country which deals such as high temperatures or flooding or these things, they struggle to produce food. We also have water stress, which I guess is a part of it, a part of climate change. Um, Areas with low rainfall or little water for irrigation struggle to grow enough food. We see poverty. Poverty is a human factor, and people living in poverty often don't have their own land to grow food. They can also affect people's ability to farm effectively. They can't afford technology, irrigation, fertilizers, so they're often unable to produce enough food. We have conflict. Conflict can lead to the destruction of crops and livestock, and people can do it on purposely as well, especially during wars, to cut the food supplies of people. That's what happened in the World War, definitely. So, let's just do some revision over. Sorry, let's just do some revision over some factors that and the impacts of food insecurity. Okay, so sorry, everything seems to be freezing a little bit. But just to summarize, so some negative impacts of food insecurity. So, famine. This is a serious lack of food across a large area. malnutrition. So famine, serious lack of food over a large area, which can lead to starvation and death. Famine. Then we have undernutrition, which is when people don't get any food. So malnutrition is when you don't get enough nutrients, but undernutrition is when you don't get any food. Um, and it can cause development problems such as stunted growth. And it actually, in sub Saharan Africa, stunted growth affects 40% of children. We also have soil erosion, which happens due to food insecurity because people who are struggling to produce enough food may not use the best agricultural practices, which can mess up the soil. Rising prices. As food becomes more rare, it then means that the prices of food are becoming more, would increase by a lot. And then we also have social unrest. Now, social unrest includes food shortages, rising food prices, this causing riots and then having further implications and effects. Now, how do we increase food production? There's irrigation, which is artificially watering a land. This can be used to make dry areas more productive or increase the number of harvests. So there's three different types of irrigation. There's gravity flow, sprinklers, and drip systems. So just show you the different methods. So here we have surface drip irrigation. So drip irrigation means dripping water from these small holes in pipes directly into the soil. So you can see that there is a pipe here, and then it's slowly dripping the water, allowing just enough water to be used. Now, there's also another method called, okay, well, they don't have images here, but they will look similar to this. There's also sprinklers, which just spray the water across the fields, and then there's gravity flow. So gravity flow is when you dig ditches and channels to transport the ground or surface water into the fields. So let me get you a diagram so that you can see this. Okay, well, unable to find you a good diagram. Let me just try and. Okay, sorry. There's a bit of delay with this, but so yeah, gravity digging the ditches and channels to transport the groundwater and allow fields to access the water. Now there's also hydroponics and aeroponics. So hydroponics and aeroponics are both methods of growing plants without soil. So hydroponics, plants grow in a nutrient solution. I'm just trying to find a good diagram for you for hydroponics and aeroponics. Okay, so sorry for the delay. It's just a bit of internet issues going on. Okay, so I found a good diagram for aeroponics. So let's start with aeroponics. So what happens is with aeroponics, the plants are suspended in air. This means that there's no soil or anything. So the water that contains the nutrients is then sprayed onto the roots, as you can see here. Now, as they are sprayed upon the roots, the water then drips off the roots and is then recycled again. So you can see this is a very sustainable system in which the plant roots are sprayed at with air and after they're suspended in the air. Now we also have hydroponics. Hydroponics is physically growing the plants in a solution of water. And this water is like a nutrient broth, sort of like you did we looked at in biology, GCSE biology. So here is a diagram of hydroponics. Let me just share this tab. So you can see some diagrams of hydroponics here. And this is just how the plants are grown in a nutrient solution. So imagine a bath, and it's supported by materials like rock wool or gravel or clay balls. So hydroponics and aeroponics are both two really good systems in which plants are monitored closely, the nutrients are adjusted, the nutrients are also recycled, less water is needed, and there's a reduced risk of disease and pests because they're in a controlled system. However, the issues of hydroponics and aeroponics is all about money. They're very expensive, so these methods currently only are used for high value crops. Now, another method to increase food production is biotechnology. This involves genetically engineering crops to increase the production. So, I'm sure you must have heard about GM crops when studying biology, if you've studied biology. So GM crops is genetically modified crops. So you can edit the genetics of a crop to make sure that it produces higher yields. It has more protein in it. It's more enriching. It produces bigger crops and things like that. And that's what GM crops are used for. They also can be used to be resistant to drought and disease. Now, you also need to know something about the New Green Revolution. What this is the New Green Revolution aims to increase the yields through sustainable methods such as GM crops, traditional and organic farmings that include soil nutrient recycling, crop rotation. So instead of using mass produced food that has loads of fertilizer in it, trying to make it more sustainably sourced. And finally, appropriate technology. So using high-tech methods like hydroponics and GM crops can be expensive and are not always practical. So using some local schemes, for example, in LICs, individual wells are used with easy to main mechanical pumps or a small drip irrigation system. Now, at this point, there will be an example. So, in the CGP book, it's irrigation and how it helps Burkina Faso, and we'll be looking at that sometime this week. There are two challenges that in making sure that food supplies are sustainable. So one is growing enough food to meet the rising population, and two, to make sure that the environment isn't damaged. So again, the principles of sustainability focusing on us now, but also making sure that there is enough for the future as well. So we're not just starving out the future generations. So we have low impact farming, which makes it food supplies more sustainable. So the first method is organic farming. So organic farming uses natural processes to return the nutrients to the soil so that the crops can be continuing to grow. So what this means is that crops, animals, and empty areas are then rotated, and natural fertilizers, such as cow manure, can be used, which are less damaging than the acidic and chemical fertilizers currently being used. Now, Another thing called permaculture is also being used. So what permaculture is it aims to produce food in a way that recreates natural ecosystems. So the aim in permaculture is to protect the soil and rejuvenate the soil. So what happens is the food production is designed to be low maintenance and keeps the soil healthy. So one method is mixed cropping. So mixed cropping is when plants of different heights and different types are grown in one area. So this means that the available space and light are used better. And this means that there are fewer pests and diseases and less watering is required. Another thing is introducing natural predators, which reduces the need for pesticides. So instead of chemical pesticides, using more natural versions such as natural predators like slugs, which will deal with all of the chemicals. And the final method for low impact farming to make it more sustainable is urban farming initiatives. So, urban farming uses empty lands, rooftops, balconies, basically places where there's extra space that's not being used. So if you know a corner shop, for example, then urban farming, an example would be planting on that rooftop a green space where you can plant food and grow food. Now, urban residents also use allotments, which are very good as well. Now, urban farming have some advantages. Firstly, it makes food locally available. Secondly, it reduces the need to transport it from long distances, so reduces the need for transportation. And we looked at food miles and how that has an impact on that. Now, this then means that the food is fresher, so it's more nutritious, and it also adds greenery to cities, which actually has evidence of reducing the stress. Now, eating sustainably and reducing waste is also another sustainable method. So, making sure that food supplies are not just about better growing techniques, but also about how we can consume less food as well, especially within the UK. So, firstly, making sure that our fish and our meat is from sustainable resources. So, how we do this overfishing due to consumption, increased consumption. So sustainable fishing is using catch quotas, and these limit the amount of fish taken. So making sure that you're only eating fish that are not at risk of being overfished. Raising animals for meat is also bad for the environment. So instead of having chickens that are not that don't produce free range eggs, that are stuck in a cage and have very unhealthy lifestyles, give them more space and feed them on locally sourced food rather than imported food, and make sure that um, when eating the animal all the edible parts are eaten, so not wasting that as well. Another way to do this is seasonal food consumption. So, this is in many high income countries, people are expected to get the food they like all year round, and these foods have to be imported. So, we need to change this lifestyle because importing this food is not sustainable. So, transport adds these food miles, which increases the carbon's footprint. So, instead, we should eat seasonally. So, only eating the food that grows locally within that month period. And finally, reducing waste and reducing losses. So, globally, one third of the food that is produced is either lost or wasted. Now, you may be confused when I say lost. Lost normally means that, like, loads of ships are sunk as cargoes because of, for example, wars that are going on. Um, but the fact that one third of the global food outputted is actually wasted is a very scary figure, considering many people are in hungry, starving circumstances, which are literally dying of starvation. So, schemes introduced, such as Think, Eat, Save, or Love Food, Hate Waste, encourages individuals, businesses, and governments to waste less food. Okay. Then there's an example about how a sustainable food supply is used. Okay. So either now we've just finished all about food. So your topic that you would normally study would either be about water or it would be about energy. So water supply or energy supply. So I'm just going to quickly check something about which one we should cover. Okay, let's see. So energy. Okay, so I've just looked over the topics and I've realized that it's much more beneficial for you, especially if you study the sciences, if you're doing the science GCSEs as well, to do the energy topic, because in terms of the water topic, there's a lot more new content, whereas the energy topic is quite straightforward because we already know a lot about renewable energy and ways to increase that. So energy is definitely a topic you should do if you have the choice of doing that. Um, so let's quickly go over energy. So energy security is having enough energy, reliable, interrupted, affordable supply of energy. Energy surplus is when a country produces more energy than it needs, and an energy deficit is when they need more energy than they produce. In terms of food, I just changed it because of the fact that energy is actually a much better topic to do because of the fact that a lot of the topics are already more obvious. But you can study food if you want, it's up to you. I'm just going to go over energy. I'm sorry if that causes any issues. I don't know if I should leave science for last minute because I'm really bad at it. And if I start revising now, I would not have any time to revise any other subjects. And I just want to pass it grade through right now. Okay, so in terms of the sciences, what I would just say is that sorry, in terms of the sciences, I would say that for me, I was definitely not good at the sciences, but I would say don't focus too much on the content because you're time pressured now. I would definitely say instead of revising, do practice questions. And I know you'll say, oh, but I don't know how to do uh, practice questions because of the fact that sorry, I don't know how to do practice questions because I don't know the content, but doing practice questions really helps because a lot of the questions are repeated. So I know you don't have enough time, but I definitely think you can get above a grade 3 in this time period that you have. How many weeks do you have now? I don't know how many weeks you have till GCSE, but you definitely have enough time to improve your grades. I would say don't leave it till last minute. Try to create a mix of topics and things that you're studying every day. Um, yeah, I know. I know the thing is with exam questions that you often have to know the content first. But the thing is, I would say do the questions, okay? And then check the mark scheme and literally memorize the mark scheme because I'm not joking. That is literally all you need to do to get good grades in sciences because the questions are repeated and it's not more the content, but it's more how they want you to answer it. And that's just, it's unfair, it's unfortunate, but it's actually the best way in order to for sciences, especially if you have time. So maybe spend a bit of time on your content, but definitely do exam questions. Um, is there realistically speaking enough time to get nines? What are you speaking about in regards to? Is that the geography or the sciences? Sorry, I'm a bit confused. What's going on? I think it's a bit of I managed and I'm just content. Well, generally it's good. Okay, I guess people have content, then that's good for you. And if that works for you, say that exam questions are definitely worth a try, but it's up to you. I definitely know that for your year 2023, in terms of the GCSEs and also the A levels as well, that people are going to be the grade boundaries are going to be much higher for your year because they're going up since you guys are not being you guys apparently haven't been affected by COVID. So they're going to go up by a lot. So I think in order to get the grades that you want, you're going to have to work a lot harder than any of the years before you did. But yeah, I think it's a balance really. Try past papers, try content. I'll just say try and memorize how to answer questions because that's also really helpful. But if the other person did it without having to do exam questions, then I guess it's a mix, right? Are you worried about any other subjects or is it just sciences that you're a bit concerned about? Like I know a lot of students are scared about English literature because they are unsure how to answer things like that. So feel free to just say it in the chat. But let me actually continue with this topic because we're almost done. So where do we get up to? Water or energy? Okay. Um, that's fine. Geography is easy. Geography is easy. I guess it's relative. I think geography is one of the easier subjects, definitely. Um, yeah, there is definitely paper three though, which does confuse a lot of people. But I guess it's up to you, whatever your strengths are in. If you're able to waffle, then GCSE Geography should be easy for you. Okay, so we're just in the middle of Geography Energy. So just wrapping the topic up, and then I'll do some chat questions later if you want. Um, the global demand for energy is increasing because of three reasons. So one is rising population. Two is economic development. Which is just that as countries have increased their wealth, they are more likely to have access to electricity. Um, and then technological advances. Sorry, the internet is not letting me write. But so technological advances, things like new devices that need energy, for example, computers, mobile phones, they're becoming more readily available. And also these technological advances are happening at a faster and faster rate. Okay. Energy supply is affected by many factors. So, first of all, the global distribution of fossil fuels is unequal. Fossil fuels are also non-renewable, so and more countries are banning it as well. The location of fossil fuels affects the cost and ease of extraction. So, the ones in the USA are trapped in rocks, so it's more expensive to get it from there. In terms of technological factors. Some technology makes it easier to exploit existing resources, for example, autonomous machines that don't need people to operate them. However, some countries are still unable to exploit their own energy resources because they don't have the uh, ability and the access to do that. So, finally, energy supply and demand. Obviously, one outweighs the other in different countries. Um, Environmental and economic costs. So, energy insecurity has a range of impacts. As fossil fuels are used up, reserves are less accessible, and therefore more environmentally sensitive areas are then exploited. This increases the cost of producing energy and risks environmental damage. Also, energy insecurity can limit how many agricultural machines can be used. The demand for cleaner and cheaper energy sources could increase the demand for biofuels. Potential for conflict as well, because obviously, since some countries have lots of energy resources and some countries don't, it then creates this inequality, and so countries have to rush, and it can cause conflict and break out into conflict, such as loads of conflicts that have been happening within the Middle East. Um, and increasing renewable energy supplies, so solar, hydroelectric power, geothermal, tidal power, wave, wind power, and biomass energy. These can all be used, they're all renewable, and wind energy in the UK can especially be used because the UK is the windiest region on Earth. Okay. Increasing non renewable energy supplies. So, fossil fuels have traditionally supplied most of our energy, but they will eventually run out. So, we need to start using other forms of energy. So, nuclear energy has actually been increasing since the 1950s. It can be used to generate a large amount of energy, and only a small amount has to be used, which is why nuclear energy is really good. So, the issue is, however, nuclear power is not only expensive, but the radioactive material then has to be stored elsewhere after it's been used. More energy can actually be extracted by developing new technology to improve the efficiency. And new breeder reactors can actually generate more fuel as they operate. So there's positives and negatives to nuclear power. Now, extracting fossil fuels have obviously got their advantages, disadvantages. Sustainable energy means future generations can meet their energies now. A carbon footprint is a measure of your energy use. Energy can be conserved in various ways. There are lots of ways that energy use can be reduced. Um, so, sustainable design using insulation, solar panels. Transport can be designed to use energy more sustainably, switching to electric, biofuels. Demand can be reduced by giving people incentives to lower their energy use, improving public transport facilities, fitting smart energy meters, using technology to increase efficiency, hybrid cars, regenerative braking, which is when road vehicles and trains can be fitted with devices to store the energy lost when they break so it can be used later. Then there's an example, and that is it. So that is GCSE Geography done, or at least the main content has been done. So well done for all of you that's managed to come here, do at least half an hour worth of work. That's definitely amazing. This was a very, very long live stream. If you have any more questions, feel free to blurt them out now. Okay. So does anyone have any more questions about revision, just general GCSE stuff? I'm available to answer it. Let's see. So fieldwork is the way to go. Sand dunes all day. Yes, so fieldwork is for paper 3, if anyone has any questions. And I think you just got your pre-release booklet for paper 3 as well, which you should use to answer. But yeah, if you have any more questions, feel free to chat. I'll be available for the next 5 to 10 minutes, and then I'll end the stream there. In terms of tips into remembering poems, I would suggest that when I was doing my GCSEs, I actually instead remembered quotes and points I was going to say in order to compare them instead of just memorizing poems, because I felt like it was kind of useless to memorize every single poem. So what I did instead was find the key quotes in each poem, so like 2 or 3 quotes per poem that I was going to analyze and compare it with another poem, and then I memorized that instead. And that was better for me personally. But if you wanted to memorize poems, then you could, I don't know, just practicing it daily, maybe listen to recordings of someone reading it and then it'll just go into your head like that. But it's up to you. But I definitely say that memorize the quotes instead, and that will definitely be helpful. Okay, that is it for today's session. Thank you so much for watching. I am so grateful that you came. And well done for everyone who actually turned up as well. I feel like you guys are getting serious about your GCSEs, which is really good. So see you soon. I will be doing live streams tomorrow, I think, and then Monday through Friday, and then all the way up until GCSEs. I'll probably be doing after school daily live streams to keep you productive. So feel free to join in whenever you are free. But yeah, again, thank you for watching and see you soon.